Hello and welcome once again to Who and What Are We Educating? The show that tries to look at the various children that our education system is catering for and to explore how good or bad or inadequate or adequate for that matter the education system in terms of preparing our young people today for tomorrow's careers. With me in the studio today is a young lady that has a lot of drive and passion for these young people. Her name is Charlotte Alfred, and hopefully she'll be sharing with us a lot of useful tips and knowledge in regards to this. So once again, welcome, Charlotte.
Hey, Chuck. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I've had many guests who've actually given indications as to what their views are and opinions are, and some of them were very technical. Not that necessarily technical, but it's been interesting for myself in terms of understanding how the education system maps out and how suitable it is and where the flaws are. But I guess the best place to always start is find out a bit more about yourself for our audience to know who you are. So why education as a career? What brought you into education?
So, what brought me into education? It was actually an accident, if I'm going to be totally honest. It wasn't my first choice career path. I started off in administration, and I was working for around the late 90s, early 2000s. I was working for the Benefits Agency, which is now DWP,
Right.
Department of Work and Pensions. And I was employed as a admin officer, but in the fraud department.
Right. That's interesting.
Very interesting. And I worked there for about 2 years, and I got fed up of the system. When you're investigating people who are struggling to make ends meet because they're claiming benefits like income support and housing benefit, and they've got a job that they've not declared as a cleaner, earning an additional £80 a week, and they hadn't declared it, and you had to build a case on that. And it just got really, really tiring, and I felt that when you looked into some of these cases, these were single parents with children, and from my experience I was a single parent at the time, I could relate to them just wanting a little bit more money
extra for the family.
Yeah. And then so that was one end of the scale, and then on the other end you had someone who had multiple businesses, who was claiming housing benefit, income support, and disability living allowance.
Wow.
Who was, seen working, like 7 till 6 in their shops. On investigation, they didn't have no disability, and was actually, claiming thousands and thousands of money. And so when you looked at that end of the scale, but the way you go about investigating these cases was very much the same, in terms of bringing those people into the office when you had your evidence and interviewing them both under caution. Just felt a little bit, I didn't feel it was measured, and I just felt like, I don't know if this is for me. So I started thinking about my options. As I said, I was a single parent.
Yeah.
I had my son was my son was 5 at the time. He had just started school, and I started reflecting and thinking, the hours that I was working, was I spending enough time with my child? I really wanted to be present for him. So I just started looking into other careers. And I've come from a big family, and my siblings have children, and I've always been around children growing up.
Yeah.
And I've always loved being with children, and just, yeah. So I thought, you know what, I could work with children. And I started looking into careers with children, and I thought, you know what, let me try being a teaching assistant.
Yeah.
So I did a TA course, and it started from there, and I absolutely loved it. It felt so rewarding. So that's where my career started.
So years later, you are now in a position of, I know, but obviously for our audience, what's your official title now?
I'm a nurture lead teacher.
Okay, we're going to delve into that a bit more, but I just want to take a little step back. It seems the description you gave for whilst working as DWP was quite rigid in that respect. And it's something that a previous guest had indicated. In fact, quite a few people had indicated that the education system itself wasn't flexible enough. It was quite rigid in its approach towards trying to deal with many things, and that may be a reason why it's not quite working. And if I remember correctly, one guest actually, their quotation was, the education system doesn't work, it's just that the young people make it work for them. Which I found quite interesting, looking at it from that side of things. So let's move forward. So nurture practitioner, can you tell us a bit, what's that about,
So a nurture practitioner is basically somebody that can emotionally hold a young person to support their learning. So it would be, so here, for example, we have nurture practitioners.
Yeah.
In some schools they have teaching assistants.
Yeah.
Or they have learning support assistants or behaviour support workers and so on.
Yeah.
Well, we have nurture practitioners, and that's because we are trauma informed.
Okay.
And we use a trauma-informed approach to work with young people. So that's understanding that there could be attachment needs. And it's understanding the things behind the child, the things underneath, which is stopping them from accessing the education in the classroom. So that person can be co-regulating that young person at sometimes, or just be a physical, present person that offers a safe place, that has a good relationship with that young person, and that has built up a level of trust in order to make that young person feel safe and secure in the environment.
I've heard it said that in terms of nurture, an example given by a previous guest is that whereas, for example, in a mainstream school, children will just come in and go straight to the classes.
Yeah.
If, however, one person comes in and they're not regulated or don't feel emotionally ready, you maybe sit them to one side and give them time to settle down, maybe get them water or something like that, ask about their well-being. Give them that time and then phase them into lesson. That's what we're talking about here. Yes. As an example.
Yeah, that's an example. That's an example of it.
Right. That's just so that our guests, audience understand a bit more visually what it is, what we're referring to.
So the first one is children's learning is understood developmentally. Yeah. Shall I explain a little bit more about that?
No, please.
Okay, so that is coming from the knowledge that just because a child is 12 years old, we know their chronological age is 12 years old.
Yeah.
What we understand is that just because that young person is 12 years old, it doesn't mean academically, socially, emotionally that they are performing or presenting at that age.
Okay.
So it's not assuming. It's not assuming that just because a child is 12, 13, 14, that emotionally they are at that age, academically they are at that age, holistically. We have to really understand where a child is developmentally in order to meet their needs.
I could actually see where a lot of conflicts could arise in the mainstream school because obviously children move up based on age group.
Yeah.
So there's no accounts placed upon where they are emotionally or so forth. So therefore, if they're not performing based on the year group they're in, I could see where the problems could arise.
Yeah, problems do arise, then a child will be labelled as they're not meeting their milestones or they've not reached their target for that year. Yeah. For example, year 7 or year 8. And what would then happen is that on paper, that child would be behind their peers. And there could be a lot of reasons. There could be EAL issues. There could be undiagnosed learning needs. There could be developmental issues as well. But if I speak on the emotional side and that kind of mental side of that young person, it's good to understand that all children develop differently emotionally, based on their experiences, their culture, their background, their environment. So, as I said, a young person may be 12 on paper, but emotionally, they may not be so emotionally secure. And they could be responding and behaving in a way that maybe an 8-year-old or a 7-year-old would respond to.
Yes.
Thank you. And so sometimes when we see those things, we start, from my point of view, I would be thinking, is there any adverse childhood experiences there? Is there any trauma? Is there attachment needs? And I'll be looking at ways to develop that emotional side of that young person. Okay. So that's the first one.
Can I just pause you this? I know I asked for the 6 principles, but some of the things you said are quite interesting, so I really want to explore that a bit more.
Yeah.
In terms of, it's not really looking at factual answers, but just your idea of what things may look like. Yeah. So as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself visually. Obviously, I went to school and I know how things worked, but I'm thinking visually, in terms of a mainstream school, if you don't have, like I said, if you have a child who's not emotionally ready, so if the child is not emotionally ready, okay, so what I'm looking at now and then, in terms of mainstream schools, which are the predominant number of schools in the United Kingdom. I guess I didn't make it clear for our audience that you actually work in alternative provision.
Yes,
right.
I do.
Okay, so we're going to go into that a bit further down the road. But I'm trying to think visually how this would work in trying to get mainstream schools prepared and being able to deal with this, embed this system into a mainstream school. Because if you had to pull out, say I have 1,000 students, I had to pull out 200 students because they had an instant issue coming to school, so we want to regulate them. What that would do to the whole, could actually go ahead with this kind of thing?
I think with, it's funny you say like in mainstream schools, the place for me where it starts is going back to what schools are expected to do.
Right, okay, interesting.
Yeah. So I feel that the education system is quite dated.
Yes.
And, there's so many questions. Are we preparing children in 2023 for this current world? Does the curriculum match? Is it suited for the learner? Or is it just one size fits all? That is what I think. There's so many questions that we can throw out there, because we're talking about the emotional side, the developmental side emotionally for that young person, and they may not be ready to just come into school at 9 o'clock, go to registration, go to lesson, transition around the school effectively. But that is the system that we have. And so for me, it's a wider issue. It's trying to make sure that the education system that we have fits every single young person and that no child is left out.
All right, so we're talking beyond curriculum, look at this whole structure of the education system. Do you think, because I for one grew up in a system where in my early years we had to pass certain exams to move on to the next academic year. So it wasn't based on just rolling on age group. I mean, being an adult now, I could see the problems with that system itself. As in that, I recall a young chap who was in my year group. By the time I got to, say, year 5, he was still in year 1 or 2. Looking back at now, I kind of believe there was probably SCN issues involved there, which wasn't being taken account of back then. So again, it's looking at what society or government or whoever's in power, whatever it is, to look at what would that look like now. I have had conversations with other guests who kind of suggested maybe hold somebody back 1 year and then moved on. Whether that's work, whether that's funding, it's quite massive.
See, again, I think like we're going into this one size fits all. Why not have individual pathways for individual students? You know, what works for one student is not necessarily going to work for somebody else. And
Indeed.
I feel that more time needs to be invested in expanding the curriculum, expanding, just looking out there and thinking about how can we create individual pathways so that every child feels like they are progressing. You know, what success looks like for one person is not going to be the same. And if we're rigid in our systems, then we're going to have a lot of young people that feel like failures.
And probably end up being excluded from school,
right?
Which is what we're seeing a lot more these days.
If we go back to the point I was trying to make about, a child's chronological age and their developmental age, I believe if more time was invested in appropriate assessment mechanisms for schools, because right now, if we look at the mainstream schools, what are they? How are they baselining young people? They're baselining young people academically. You know, where are they in maths? What were their SATs levels in primary schools? What should they be when they reach the end of Key Stage 3? And, for me, more time needs to be invested in looking for appropriate assessment methods like the Boxall profile, like SDQs, strengths, difficulties, questionnaires, the emotional literacy assessments to find out where young people are holistically, not just academically, and then we'll be able to meet the needs of the learner better, not just academically, but meeting the other side, that person inside, their social needs, their emotional needs, their mental health needs. Not getting everybody on the same page. So we put on some professional development for staff around attachment and trauma, around adverse childhood experiences, around emotion coaching. When a young person is dysregulated, how do we communicate in that time with a young person? We've put on training. I would say it was over about 3 years, worth of training with staff, really upskilling staff, and I feel that's where the change happened first. When the adult changes the way they communicate with a young person, when the adult creates that safe environment in their classroom, you start beginning to see young people wanting to come into the class. Those children that used to be running around in the corridors, actually, they want to come into the class now because actually Miss has made that class really nice and I feel safe in there. And the way Miss speaks to me, she's always welcoming. She likes seeing me in her class. She knows me by my first name, or she never forgets my name. She sees me in the corridor and says hello. I like being in Mrs. class, so I'm going to go to that lesson, know. So we have seen, changes like that. There's less children in the corridor. There's more children inside their class. There's more children learning. There's reflective conversations going on with a young person and an adult, which is always really good to see. If I just touch on the last nurture principle, indeed, which says the importance of transitions in a children's life, embedding that in the school has really helped because we have more staff available during transitions to help students who struggle with transition get to their lesson or calm down or settle down quite quickly after unstructured break time or unstructured lunchtime. We have seen positive changes.
It sounds like a lot of quite impactful changes.
Can I mention something else?
Yeah, please do.
Attendance as well, where you've had people that have had persistent low attendance, and during this time of change, having the mentors and the form tutors, just with that relational approach, checking in on the young person, on their parents, like, oh, how we noticed so and so didn't come into school today. How are they? Let them know that I'm looking forward to seeing them next time. There's no penalizing for not coming in. It's like, how can I support you? How can I support that young person to come in? Or let me just do a welfare check to let that young person know that even though they're not here, I'm still thinking about you. So we've seen attendance improve.
That's powerful. That's really powerful.
Yeah.
But it's something, to me, this is genuinely what all schools should be doing. How they can go about doing that is something we obviously don't know, because like many guests have said, one of the holding factors is funding.
Yeah.
If you had your receptionist or secretary on the phone calling all, say 10% of a school, the typical school is 850, so you're calling 85 students. At what point are you going to get work? So you have to employ another staff to do those phone calls. It's a different challenge, a different conversations I've had, but clearly one that's an important one.
Definitely. And if I just, as well, I think what I can mention has really helped attendance, or I would say punctuality, is that, the whole school offers a free breakfast club.
Okay.
And so a young person can come in and they can get breakfast, they can get toast, they can get cereal before they go to their lesson. And even if that young person is late and that person has an air, that person can get something to eat before they go into their lesson. And that's really nice as well. Just making sure, if we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that basic food and water being really fundamental. So I think that's really helped with punctuality as well.
That's very important, because I remember coming across a report that showed that schools, and this has been a while now, 5 years now, schools were spending on average £43 million of their own money to feed young people and their families, which is quite, for a rich nation, that's quite a dire picture to paint, but that's the reality of what's going on.
It is.
It's, again, the word funding springs to mind, and this is a conversation that I would like to have somebody in the hierarchies of government departments to see where we're going to. But I'm sure I'm going to get some political speak as to what they're doing and real investments and so forth.
Yeah, and this is what I mean about the whole. We need to rethink a lot of things. Breakfast, making sure somebody is fed in the morning, for me is important, is far more important than making somebody come in, sit down and just cracking on with their work. I've
got one. I mean, these things you've told us so far, it's just really, really, and I really hope that schools, or respect people in the schools, are listening to this. But there's one very important question I'd like to ask. You said, do you think that the rise in the need for nurture practice reflects the challenges or the level of challenges communities up and down the country are facing? So what you see in the school, does it reflect the difficulties society is experiencing? Because I know, as a fact, we see more rise in food banks, use of food banks, interest rates skyrocketing, we have issues, young people out in the streets. Does the need for nurture and the extent of nurture programs they have in place, do you think it reflects what's happening in society?
I think it does, and I think here, I would say we have the luxury of being a nurturing school, so what we're offering really does meet the needs of our young people and their families. And I would like to hope that nurture can be seen as important. Sorry, I would like to think that nurture is seen. No, okay, no, what am I saying? Sorry.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, my hope is that the importance of nurture is seen across the country. The fact that we've invested so much time ensuring that our environment is safe and children come in and they feel safe. Ensuring that we have adequate funding for breakfast to make sure that our children are well fed.
Yeah.
As you said, the rise in food banks, we can't assume that a young person has come into school and that they've had breakfast or that they've even had a meal before, so that's really important for us. And as you said, like, a nurturing school doesn't just support the young person, but they support the wider family as well. So we have family support, we have embedded practitioners, like family support workers here that work with our families, that have a bigger picture of the background of that young person, the family dynamics, so that we are able to allocate our resources appropriately. We have a charity that regularly supports us for that specific reason, for families.
Okay.
So if a young person doesn't have school shoes, if they can't afford uniform, if the family needs something, we can go into that budget and support that family in that way. So that's what we're doing. But it would be nice if there was like a sprinkle of nurture across the country in schools, and if the government really bought into nurture practice. In primary schools, nurture is so big, isn't it? It happens organically. Primary schools are nurture provisions, in my opinion, but we lose that at secondary school. And I feel when we go back to looking at the whole transitions important in children's lives, that shift, that big jump from primary school to secondary school, it's massive for a lot of our young people, and it's hard for them to understand that they don't have the same teacher day in and day out. They have to move around the building, and they might have 7 different teachers in a day. And that might be overwhelming for some young people because, as I said, if we go back to, some of the elements of nurture, it's relational approaches. How can you build relationships with young people quickly if you only see that young person once or twice a week?
Or even every fortnight.
Depending on their timetable. With so many transitions in such big schools, how do you ensure the environment is safe? You've got little year 7s walking in the corridor with year 11s, and that might be a bit intimidating. How do we ensure that their transitions are smooth, and that while they're transitioning, that they still feel safe in this environment? So I think there's a lot of things that we can learn from, nurture principles, nurture practice, and we could embed, into mainstream schools. I think just little things,
one step at a time.
Definitely one step at a time.
Is it what you just said now? Speak to what you said earlier on in terms of the education system, the need for restructuring, because in a sense, taking a child from primary school, which you've established is a nurture environment, and then throwing them straight into secondary school is making an assumption that all children are the same and they can all equally, without realizing that how emotionally that a particular child may or may not be prepared for that change in the environment. And the system doesn't allow or take account for that. It's just move on with the crowd and that's it. So in a sense, you could see the early stages for a potential failure down the road.
Definitely.
The significance of this, I guess what I'm going to is that I saw a documentary where, and this was based in America, where children who had got, or should we say, who were post-16, who were in prison at the time, identified that if what they pointed at was a nurture approach had been implemented in their school at that early stage, they wouldn't get to that point because it's one issue after the other, which was seen as a challenge in authority. Then you got exclusion point 1, exclusion point 2, and then interaction with gangs in the streets. And then before you know it, crime is committed. Before you know it, you're before the judge, then prison. And then it just escalates worse. If school had said, okay, you know what, let's look and understand what is the issue. And like you said rightly, some of them actually identified it was just simply they went to rob because they had not eaten food. There's no money in the house. So, but it was just
I've seen that firsthand. Young person that is left this year. We've known since primary. He was in the primary pupil referral unit.
Okay.
And, comes from a very poverty-stricken background. English as an additional language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or like I said earlier.
Yeah. Parents' first language at home was Portuguese. So there was a language barrier with family, with the young person in school, and that young person got to an age where they wanted certain things, but parents just really couldn't afford it, and that young person eventually unfortunately was groomed, because somebody offered to buy them things, and they just thought, okay, that's really nice, and didn't really understand what the consequences of taking the items from that young person would lead to. So yes, I've definitely seen things like that. And if I just go back to something that you said about young people that end up in the prison system, when you look back, and it started with challenging authority, I just thought about something there. Was like, how do we not know if that young person, for example, may have come from an environment at home where there was domestic violence,
right.
And when they came to school, didn't feel safe, and they were kind of on that fight or flight, mode, always hyper vigilant. So when they were challenged, their natural response was to be defensive. That could be one way. I know some people shut down that have experienced domestic violence, but I know a lot of young people tend to fight. That's their natural response. And it's not understanding sometimes in a mainstream context with so many teachers. Not all teachers have that right information about the young person, so may not know how to approach that young person. So maybe the way that adult approached that young person resembled what they were seeing at home.
At home, right?
Maybe that person raised their voice, and what that young person knows is, when I hear raised voices, something's going to happen. So I'm going to fight. So. Which is why we go back to the whole relational approach, and, language being a vital means of communication, the environment being a safe place. That, I never encourage people to raise their voice. We just never know what's going on in a young person's life. So it's that environment being a safe place is about that adult being calm, and, and facilitating that environment that young person feels safe regardless of what's happening. So yeah, I can understand why we have a lot of young people in the prison system at the moment, because I can't remember the percentage, but there is a very high percentage of young people in prison that have speech, language, and communication needs.
I believe I've come across that before myself, and I for one don't know the percentage, but yes, I've come across a report
that has attachment and trauma, that has adverse childhood experiences, Yeah.
Is it? You told us again a lot of very useful things, and what keeps ringing in my head is that, along the lines of what you said, that we genuinely need to look at the education system from the bottom up, not top down. Because top down, you start playing around politics, because what schools, and it starts with the word you said right at the start, at the beginning, which is that we still run a Victorian system, in effect.
It's dated.
It's dated, yes. That's the very word you used, yes.
That it doesn't, it's not fit for purpose. I don't believe the education system now is not fit for purpose for the children that we have.
The environment they'll see out there in society.
Right.
Schools, in effect, using that system that was established back then 200 years ago can't cope with it. Hence, we're seeing more exclusions because it's seen as you're challenging authority. But when in actual sense, like you said, we need to understand what the issues the child is coming from.
We've got the one size fits all. It's not the case. We need to have options. We need to cater for the individual. We need to have individual learning pathways for young people. It shouldn't just be, okay, you come to school, you study these subjects, and that's it. There's no choice in the matter. You study these subjects. Because obviously there's going to be some that they're going to excel in. There's some that some young people will struggle in because it's just not their way they learn. Some people are more hands-on. They're more vocational. They need to do more applied learning. Where some people are, they can actually do the theory side. But we need to cater for everybody. We need to have options. Because otherwise, as I said, we're just going to have a lot of young people that just feel like they're failing. Every day they're failing because they have to go to this lesson. So, yeah.
Excellent. So, Minister for Education, that's a lot of food for thought. And in terms of food, Miss Charlotte Alfred, nurture practitioner, what you've given us is like Christmas dinner. Okay, once again, thank you very much for coming in. It's been amazing, and I really appreciate your time here with us and the invaluable knowledge you've given our audience. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I mean, there's so much more that I could say. Maybe there's a part 2.
Oh, no, there definitely has to be.
One thing I would like to leave your listeners with, anybody that's interested in just having a bit of a read of something, have a look at the Nurture UK website.
Yeah.
It's nurtureuk.org. Or there's a book that I would recommend.
Please, absolutely.
It's called Attachment for Teachers by Marie Delaney.
Okay.
Awesome book. So many practical tips for classroom teachers, for just staff in schools in general, just how to embed those principles, how to understand, behaviour as communication and the effects of attachment and trauma on a young person. So I would say that's definitely a starting point.
Ah, superb. You heard that. Go out, get a copy. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you.